Jack Johnson was more than a boxer. He was a symbol of defiance, a man who shattered racial barriers and refused to conform. As the first black heavyweight champion, he dominated the ring and lived life on his own terms, infuriating white America in the process. But beyond his victories, there are secrets about his life that many don't know, shocking details hidden in history, scandals that made him a government target, and the tragic, overlooked truth about his final moments. Why did the U.S. government go to such lengths to bring him down? How did his personal life spark nationwide outrage? And what revelation about his death remains largely untold? This is the story of Jack Johnson, the man who shook the world and paid the ultimate price for it. Jack Johnson was born on March 31st, 1878 in Galveston, Texas, the son of former slave. Growing up in the segregated South, he quickly learned that the world was not designed for black men to succeed. Racism was deeply ingrained in society, and opportunities were scarce. But Johnson was never one to accept limitations. From an early age, he showed a rebellious streak, one that would define his career and make him both a champion and a target. Unlike many black men of his time, Johnson refused to be submissive. He was confident, outspoken, and unafraid to challenge the status quo. He dressed in fine suits, drove expensive cars, and carried himself with an arrogance that infuriated white America. His defiance wasn't just in the way he spoke or acted. It was in the way Johnson turned to boxing as a teenager, fighting in underground matches to earn money. He had natural talent, but more importantly, he had an unshakable belief in himself. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting to prove that he belonged. At the time, boxing was heavily segregated. Black fighters were forced to compete among themselves, with little chance of breaking into the mainstream. White champions refused to defend their titles against black challengers, fearing both humiliation and the backlash of a society that refused to accept black superiority in any form. But Johnson didn't care. He was determined to become the best, no matter what barriers were in his way. Through sheer skill and determination, Johnson rose through the ranks, defeating every opponent in his path. He won the colored heavyweight championship in 1903, the highest title a black fighter could achieve at the time, but he wanted more. He wanted the world championship, the title that white America believed no black man could ever hold. For years, Johnson chased the reigning heavyweight champion. Tommy Burns, who, like many before him, refused to fight a black challenger. But Johnson was relentless, following Burns around the world, taunting him publicly and demanding a title shot. The pressure eventually became too great, and in 1908, Burns finally agreed to face Johnson in a highly publicized match in Sydney, Australia. When the fight began, it was clear that Burns was no match for Johnson. Johnson toyed with him, dodging punches effortlessly and landing sharp counters. He smiled, laughed, and mocked Burns throughout the fight, humiliating him in front of the crowd. The bout was so one-sided that police had to step in and stop the fight in the 14th round to prevent further embarrassment. With that victory, Jack Johnson made history. He became the first black heavyweight champion of the world. But his win was more than just a sporting achievement. It was a direct challenge to the racial hierarchy of the time. He had shattered a barrier that white America never wanted broken. Instead of celebrating Johnson as a great athlete, the media and the public reacted with outrage. Newspapers ran racist headlines, portraying him as a threat to society. White boxing promoters scrambled to find a way to take the title back, launching a desperate search for a great white hope who could defeat him. Jack Johnson had done the unthinkable. He had proven that a black man could dominate the most prestigious division in sports. But rather than accept his greatness, white America wanted revenge. And from that moment on, Johnson's biggest fight would no longer be in the ring. It would be against a society that was determined to destroy him. Jack Johnson wasn't just a champion. He was a defiant symbol of black excellence in a world that wanted to keep him down. After claiming the heavyweight title in 1908, he refused to play by the rules of our racist society. He wore expensive tailored suits, drove the finest cars, and flaunted his wealth with an arrogance that enraged white America. But what angered them the most was his refusal to be humble. Johnson lived life unapologetically, spending his money freely and enjoying his fame. He wasn't just a fighter, he was a celebrity, and he carried himself like one. He dined in high-end restaurants, socialized in elite clubs, and refused to be treated as anything less than a king. But nothing sparked more outrage than his relationships with white women, at a time when interracial relationships were considered taboo and even illegal in some states. Johnson openly courted, dated, and even married white women. He didn't hide it, he certainly didn't apologize for it. This wasn't just a personal choice, it was a direct challenge to the racial hierarchy of the time. White America saw Johnson as a threat, and the media painted him as a villain. Newspapers published vicious attacks, calling him an arrogant Negro and a disgrace to the sport. They described him as a menace to society, warning that his success would encourage other black men to seek the same level of power and freedom. His dominance in the ring and his extravagant lifestyle only fueled their hatred. After Johnson's historic victory over Tommy Burns, the boxing world was desperate to take the title back. Promoters launched a nationwide campaign to find a white fighter who could reclaim the heavyweight championship, a search for what they called a great white hope. Dozens of challengers stepped forward, but one by one Johnson easily defeated them. No one could match his skill, speed, or confidence in the ring. Then in 1910, former heavyweight champion James J. Jeffries was lured out of retirement to face Johnson. Jeffries had been the undefeated champion before stepping away from the sport, and many white Americans saw him as their last hope to restore racial order in boxing. The fight was hyped as more than just a sporting event. It was framed as a battle for racial supremacy. Jeffries himself declared that he was fighting for the honor of the white race. The fight took place on July 4, 1910 in Reno, Nevada, in front of a massive crowd. The tension was unlike anything the sport had ever seen. But from the opening bell, it was clear that Jeffries was no match for Johnson. Johnson dominated the fight with ease. He dodged Jeffries' sluggish punches, countered with precision, and toyed with his opponent in the ring. As the rounds passed, Jeffries, once considered unbeatable, began to crumble by the 15th round. He had been knocked down twice, something that had never happened to him before. His corner finally threw in the towel, conceding victory to Johnson. It was a defining moment in sports history. Johnson had crushed the Great White Hope and solidified his place as the best fighter in the world. But instead of being celebrated, his victory triggered nationwide outrage. Race riots erupted across the United States. White mobs attacked black communities, furious over Johnson's victory. Dozens of black people were murdered and hundreds more were injured in the violence. The government, the media, and the boxing establishment had all conspired to take Johnson down in the ring, but he had won, and now they were determined to find another way to destroy him. Jack Johnson had proven he was the greatest boxer of his era, but his fight was far from over. His real battle was just beginning, one that would take him from the heights of fame to the depths of exile, prison, and disgrace. Forces against him would stop at nothing to take him down, and soon the full power of the U.S. government would be turned against him. Jack Johnson had beaten every opponent who stepped into the ring with him, but now he was facing his greatest enemy, the U.S. government. After his victory over James J. Jeffries, Johnson became more than just a boxing champion. He became a national obsession. White America couldn't accept a black man who was not only the heavyweight champion of the world, but also living life on his own terms, wealthy, defiant, and openly dating white women. If they couldn't take his title, they would take his freedom. Officials searched for any reason to bring Johnson down, and in 1913 they found their opportunity. The Mann Act, the law passed in 1910, was originally intended to combat human trafficking, making it illegal to transport women across state lines. For immoral purposes, but for Johnson, it was nothing more than a tool. To destroy him, Johnson was charged under the Mann Act for allegedly transporting a white woman, Lucille Cameron, across state lines for illicit purposes. There was a problem. Cameron was his girlfriend, and she insisted that she had traveled willingly. The case fell apart, but the government wasn't finished. Determined to convict Johnson at any cost, prosecutors found another white woman from his past, Felshriver, a former prostitute, with whom Johnson had been romantically involved. They convinced her to testify against him, and with an all-white jury eager to see him fall, Johnson's fate was sealed before the trial even began. The courtroom proceedings were a joke. Johnson's defense argued that his relationships were consensual, that he had committed no crime, and that the charges were nothing more than a targeted attack on a successful black man, but none of it mattered. The jury deliberated for just minutes before finding him guilty. Johnson was sentenced to a year and a day in federal prison. But Jack Johnson wasn't about to go down quietly. Instead of reporting to prison, he fled the country, escaping to Canada and then traveling to Europe. For the next 7 years, he lived in exile, moving between France, Spain, and South America. Even as a fugitive, he continued boxing, taking fights wherever he could find them. During his time abroad, Johnson remained defiant, but his life was far from the glory days of his championship reign. His skills were fading. He was getting older. The fast lifestyle, lavish spending, and years of fighting had begun to wear on him. He was no longer the unstoppable force he once was, and the weight of being hunted by his own country took a toll. In 1915, while still in exile, Johnson agreed to defend his heavyweight title against Jess Willard, a white fighter, 6 feet 6 inches in height, over 4 inches taller than Johnson. The fight took place in Havana, Cuba, and it was clear that Johnson was no longer at his peak. After battling for 26 grueling rounds, in the scorching heat, he was knocked out. Some believed Johnson threw the fight in hopes of securing a deal that would allow him to return to the U.S. If that was his plan, it didn't work. Even after losing the title, he remained a wanted man. By 1920, Johnson had little choice but to return to the United States. With his career in decline and his financial situation worsening, he decided to come home and face the consequences. The moment he stepped back onto American soil, he was arrested and sent to the Leavenworth Penitentiary in Kansas to serve his 1-year sentence. The man, who had once been the most feared boxer in the world, was now a prisoner, but even behind bars. Johnson refused to break. He spent his time exercising and even helped train other inmates. He still carried himself with a pride and defiance that had defined his entire life. By the time he was released in 1921, however, the world had moved on. The heavyweight title had been reclaimed by white fighters, and Johnson was no longer the dominant athlete he had once been. The sport that had made him a legend had left him behind. His days as the world's most dangerous man were over, but his struggles were far from finished. Now free, Johnson had to find a way to survive in a country that had never wanted him to succeed. By the time Jack Johnson was released from prison in 1921, the world had changed his boxing career. Once the source of his wealth and fame is essentially over, he was 43 years old, far past his prime, in a sport that had already moved on without him. The heavyweight title now belonged to younger, fresher fighters, and Johnson was no longer the dominant force he once was. Still, he refused to fade quietly into history. He fought a handful of matches after his release, but the magic was gone. His speed had slowed, his reflexes had dulled, and his once impenetrable defense was now full of openings. No longer the untouchable champion, Johnson was now just another aging fighter, trying to recapture his past. And as the losses piled up, so did his financial troubles. During his prime, Johnson had made millions, an extraordinary sum for a black athlete, in the early 1900s. But unlike the champions who came after him, there were no financial advisors, no long-term investments, and no safety nets. Johnson lived the way he fought boldly, recklessly, and without fear of consequence. He spent freely surrounding himself with luxury. He bought the fastest cars, the finest suits, and lived in expensive hotels. He threw lavish parties, indulged in gambling, traveled the world in style. But the money didn't last. With his boxing income gone, and no endorsements or business ventures to fall back on, Thompson soon found himself struggling to maintain the lifestyle he had grown accustomed to. He had never been one to save or plan for the future. He had lived for the moment, and now those moments were slipping away. As the years passed, Johnson did whatever he could to stay afloat. He took on whatever jobs he could find, sometimes as a speaker, sometimes as a performer, sometimes as a boxer in unsanctioned carnival fights. He would step into the ring for a few dollars, taking on local challengers and traveling shows, more a spectacle than a serious competitor. The same man who had once dominated the sport was now fighting in small-town fairs, just to make ends meet. In a final attempt to capitalize on his fame, Johnson even turned to vaudeville, performing stage fights and telling stories about his days as champion. He became a novelty act, a legend, reduced to entertaining crowds who barely understood the magnitude of what he had once accomplished. Despite his struggles, Johnson remained as defiant as ever. He still carried himself with pride, still dressed in sharp suits, and still refused to bow to anyone. But behind the bravado, the reality was clear. He was a man fighting just to survive. By the 1940s, Johnson had become a relic of the past. The boxing world that he had revolutionized no longer had a place for him. The media, which had once obsessed over him, whether out of admiration or hatred, had moved on to new fighters and new controversies. The sport he had once dominated had erased him from its memory. For decades, Johnson had fought not just for himself, but for something bigger, a place in history, a challenge to the system that sought to keep him down. But now, in his later years, he found himself without the recognition or respect he deserved. He had spent his life fighting, but in the end he was left alone, struggling and largely forgotten. Jack Johnson had changed boxing forever, but the sport had not repaid him in kind. And as he approached the final chapter of his life, his greatest battle was no longer in the ring. It was against time, poverty, and the cruel indifference of history. Jack Johnson spent his life fighting, not just in the ring, but against a society determined to break him. Even as his career faded, his defiant spirit never wavered. But in the end, it wasn't an opponent or the government that took him down. It was faith, his death. Much like his life was marked by both tragedy and irony. On June 10, 1946, Johnson was driving through North Carolina when he stopped at a roadside diner to get a meal. Despite all he had achieved, despite being a former world champion, he was still a black man in the Jim Crow South. The staff refused to serve him because of his race. Furious, Johnson stormed out, got into his car, and sped down the highway, his anger fueling his reckless driving. Minutes later, he lost control of the vehicle. Crashing violently, he was rushed to a hospital, but succumbed to his injuries. Even in death, Johnson was a victim of the racism he had fought against his entire life. The man who had broken barriers and challenged an entire system was still treated as a second-class citizen. Until his final moments, it was a cruel ending. For a man who had refused to bow to anyone, after his death, Johnson's legacy was largely forgotten. The same sport that he had revolutionized, the same world that had once obsessed over him, moved on as if he had never existed. For decades, his contributions to boxing and his impact on history were barely acknowledged. His conviction under the Mann Act remained on the record, a lasting symbol of the injustice he had suffered, while later black champions, like Joe Louis and Muhammad Ali, were celebrated for their achievements. Johnson's story was often overlooked. His defiance had made him a hero to some, but an enemy to many for years. His name was buried under layers of history, remembered only by those who truly understood the significance of his battle. It wasn't until decades later that the world slowly began to recognize what Johnson had truly accomplished. Historians and activists fought to clear his name, arguing that his conviction had been a blatant act of racial persecution. Efforts to secure him a posthumous pardon began as early as the two, but for years, the request was ignored by multiple administrations. Finally, in 2018, more than 70 years after his death, President Donald Trump granted Johnson a posthumous pardon, officially overturning his conviction under the Mann Act. The pardon was a long overdue acknowledgement that Johnson had been unfairly targeted, that his persecution had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with the color of his skin. But for Johnson, justice had come too late. He never got to see his name cleared, never got to witness the recognition he deserved. He had spent his final years as a forgotten man, his legacy overshadowed by the injustices he had suffered. Today, Johnson is finally remembered for what he truly was: pioneer, a trailblazer, and one of the greatest fighters in boxing history. But his story remains a reminder of the price he paid for being a black man who refused to bow. The battles he fought outside the ring were far greater than any opponent he faced, and decided, and though he is gone, his legacy lives on, inspiring generations of fighters who continue to stand against the odds.